Kimberly here with Balfour North Texas. As some of you know, we host a UIL journalism workshop every year in East Texas, and so we wanted to share some of that information with our customers here. Today we're going to talk about UIL news writing. So a common misconception for new coaches is that you should turn your kids loose and let them write like it's a creative writing class. But there are actually guidelines and parameters that will set them up for success, and it's way less overwhelming when you get that prompt and the timer starts at a UIL event to have the rules and guidelines in mind. So, especially for UIL, there is a formula to good journalism that will make you successful every time. So first, when I get the prompt at a UIL event, I would always start with a 2-highlighter approach. This may be a little too OCD for you, and that's okay. This is how I did it. So I would take 2 highlighters and I would make a little key up in the corner of my prompt. And I would say 1 color is for facts, 1 color is for opinions. And the reason we do this is because the prompt writers will give you a big chunk of a quote from a person, and sometimes there are really good facts in that quote. And so we want to make sure we're finding all of the facts in the prompt before we start. All right. So you're searching for an Easter egg in the prompt, and that is the future date. So the future date goes in your lead. The lead is the first sentence of the story. It's the most important information. You may also hear this called a news peg, a nut graph. There are lots of different names for it, but it's the most important information, the future date. So when you find that in your prompt, you want to circle it, star it, draw some big arrows to it, however you need to do that to make sure that that information gets into your story, because if it doesn't, you're not going to place. It's like an automatic out. Okay, so then after you have your lead, which we're going to talk more about here in a second, you'll go into a formula so you know exactly what's coming next. After your lead, you go into the most important quote, then you'll do a factual transition, quote, transition, etc. until you run out of time or until you run out of story to tell. So traditionally in a newspaper, you would have a word count that you had to stay within so that it would fit on that page of the newspaper. And then they would use what's called an inverted pyramid style of writing, so that if your story had to be cut for space, let's say this is my inverted pyramid, my most important information is up here at the top, and it's descending in order of importance. So the least important information is down here at the bottom, and if we need to cut a few paragraphs to make more room for another breaking story, then you're not losing anything important. So that's what we do in this style of writing as well for UIL. Most important information in the lead, we quote people in order of importance all the way down to the least important information. Okay, so sometimes the prompt writers will kind of test you and try to trip you up by neglecting to include a future date. If that's the case, then you take the freshest, most recent angle that you can with the information you've been given. So if you were told that the school board met and they made a decision and it's a past event, then maybe your future date is when misrepresenting someone's title or misquoting someone is a big no-no, and that can get your paper tossed out pretty quickly as well. So you want to just make sure that that attribution is clean. It goes after the first sentence of a quote. So your first quote will open with quotation marks, type the sentence, comma, close quotation marks, and then title name said. Then you can continue with the quote. So it just kind of breaks it up. Here's an example. Let's say you're quoting a teacher. We poured our hearts into this fundraiser. Journalism teacher Miss Johnson said, "I've never seen my kids work so hard." So, attribution after the first sentence, title name said. Another thing that they say in journalism a lot is write tight. So they might give you too much information in the prompt, and they want to see that you know what's important to include for your reader. So it's okay if you don't include everything from the prompt, as long as you're including the most important information. We kind of already talked about this. Never editorialize. So like we wouldn't do it in our attribution, don't do it in your transition paragraphs. For example, if you said, students will be ecstatic to see the Chick-fil-A logo in the cafeteria this fall. We don't know that every student would feel that way, so we can't speak on behalf of the student body. Keep those just purely factual. So If all the quotes that you were given support that idea that kids would be excited about Chick-fil-A, we still just want to let those quotes speak for themselves, okay? If you're given differing points of view in a prompt, maybe people are on opposite sides of an issue, then you want to show both sides in the story. And then you want to end with a student quote typically, and you'll want to make it a quote that sort of wraps up the whole story, ties it with a bow nicely, and pulls it all together. So as you're running out of time in your UIL event, you want to read back through your story, proofread it, make sure your AP style is how it should be, and you want to make sure that it flows. So think about if your story would benefit from rearranging a few paragraphs, and if it would, then take a minute to do that. It's worth it. People will write comments on your paper about this transition was choppy or this had a nice flow to it, so it definitely matters in how you place. So now you know the formula for how to write. AP style does matter as well. If you're not familiar with AP style, you can get an AP style guide or check it out online. I had a workbook, Editing Today, back in the day. This is probably like an old edition, but this had a lot of worksheets that help you get familiar with those AP style rules. Challenge yourself to do a practice prompt every week and have your coach review it. And that's the best way to memorize all the rules that I've shared with you today. And if you can follow these rules, you will be successful. So practice, 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 and happy writing, y'all. And that decision will go into effect, or when it will start affecting the students. So now let's go back and talk about your lead practically. So your lead should not be long, 2-sentence max. You don't actually start with the date itself. So instead of September 7th, the school board will meet, you would want to say the school board will meet September 7th. Just goes a little nicer. So once you tell us what the story is about in that lead, you're going to move on to quote the most important person in the story. Not to be rude, but typically this is not a student quote unless the story is very specific to one student. I feel like we see that more in feature stories than in news stories. So this is usually a decision maker, superintendent, principal, teacher that's over the club that this story is about. So think practically about who is the most important or most relevant person to the story. So here's an example from an old prompt that I found laying around my apartment. So let's say the prompt is about controversial cheerleading uniforms. You will want to quote the principal, the superintendent, or the cheer sponsor who ordered those uniforms and paid for them, instead of some kid on the cheerleading squad that just thinks they're the cutest in the whole world. So then we're going to move on to factual transitions. So this is what makes or break a paper. If you know that facts go in transitions and opinions go in quotes. So remember our highlighting system? Sometimes the quote will contain good facts. So use those facts in transitions, not in your quote paragraphs. You only get a couple of sentences, so don't waste your quote space telling me facts. So for example, if you have a student that said, we raised $2,000 for our Little League team, that's awesome. You can tell me that in a transition. Give me a quote instead in that paragraph that says, man, this money just really means the world to us. My teammate couldn't afford the membership fee this year, and now we can include everyone, and that's what being a team is about. I don't know. Something a little more personal, something that is coming directly from that person that is their opinion. So every time you switch from a quote to a transition, you want to be sure you start a new paragraph that makes it easy to read for the judge or for your reader. So that means that sometimes a paragraph might be just one sentence long. You don't want to have a whole paper of just one sentence paragraphs, but every once in a while that is okay if you have a one sentence transition. A well-developed story is going to have 2 to 3 sentences per paragraph. So now let's talk about attribution. When you include a quote from someone, you have to tell your reader who said it. So every time you quote someone, you want to use the formula title, name, said. Title, name, said. So this is where we can get into some editorializing. I'll read papers where people say, Miss Johnson exclaimed, And then, I mean, I could go talk to Miss Johnson. She may say, oh, it wasn't really all that exciting. So if we just say, title name said, it's accurate, your reader kind of gets that information and just skims right over it, and it's easy to read. So misspelling a name